Hello and welcome everyone to our session on funding evidence for education in emergencies. My name is Nadeen Alalami. I am a research officer at Dubai Cares, managing our research envelope for education in emergencies, E-Cubed. I am very happy to be moderating today's session, and I would like to welcome everyone's engagement virtually or in person through the Attendee Hub on the Rewired app. So to get started with a little bit of background on why we are gathered here today. So despite the current worldwide state of emergency on education systems, which has been provoked by the COVID-19 pandemic, education in emergencies continues to be one of the most underfunded areas in humanitarian aid, and where distribution of aid is disproportionately favoring certain contexts and leaving others neglected. In this state of limited funding, where evidence-based programming and planning becomes even more vital, accessing evidence for what works, how, why, and for whom remains very difficult. Education in emergencies lags behind other sectors when it comes to evidence production, and creation efforts remain for the most part restricted to academic circles and funder-led project-specific evaluations. So this creates a situation where evidence that is required by stakeholders who are implementing EIE programs on the ground is not accessible. Those who most need the evidence do not have access to it. And where they do, a lot of the times the evidence is not responsive to their needs. In order to rewire education in emergencies, we must unlock and unleash action-oriented, demand-driven, and user-led evidence, which can be integrated into the fabric of EIE policy and practice. And for that, funders have a critical role to play, not only in increasing funding to evidence for education in emergencies, but also in facilitating funding mechanisms and approaches that enable those who are most critical to supporting education in crisis-affected contexts to access and use the tools, resources, and insights that they most require. Today's panel session brings together evidence users and evidence funders with the aim of discussing the current state and future of funding for EIE research, evidence synthesis, and use. Through today's panel, we hope to highlight gaps between current funding in education in emergencies and overall EIE evidence needs. We also hope to highlight key considerations and principles for funding education in emergencies evidence, which is integrated into policy and practice. And we hope to encourage continued and increased commitment to funding evidence for EIE in order to generate new knowledge and unlock existing knowledge in response to education in emergencies, evidence needs, and gaps. Joining me in the room today for the panel, we have the Honourable Undersecretary, Dr. Kuyok, Abol Kuyok. He is the Undersecretary of the Ministry of General Education and Instruction in South Sudan. I'm also joined by Catherine Gladwell. She is the CEO of Refugee Education UK and Director at Jigsaw Consult. We are also joined by a number of virtual speakers. We have Dr. Christian Stoff, Chief of Monitoring, Evaluation, and Global Reporting at Education Cannot Wait. We have Gerhard Pulfer, Portfolio Manager for Education in Displacement at Porticus, and Joseph Wales, Education Research Advisor at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO. So to start off today's session, I would like to turn to the Honourable Undersecretary. Dr. Kuyok is the Undersecretary of the Ministry of General Education and Instruction in South Sudan, and he is also an Associate Professor in the College of Education at the University of Juba. At the university, he teaches research methodology, sociology of education, and comparative education. So, Dr. Kuyok, it is a pleasure having you join us today. I would love to learn from you in your experience, both as a policymaker and a researcher. How can evidence for education in emergencies support decision-making and emergency response in the context of South Sudan? And what would you say are some of the key evidence needs in your context?
Good morning. Thank you very much, Nadeen. I think this is the most COVID-19 adherent room, I think. Uh, um, Thank you very much. I think I'll just put this in context. South Sudan, that got independence in 2011, is currently recovering from a 6-year conflict. And this is exacerbated by a recurrent flood for the last 2 years. Also, we have, of course, the COVID-19 outbreak in 2020. So we are living in crisis, basically, in South Sudan. Currently, we have 18% of our schools are closed. And in one particular state, almost half of the schools are closed. And this comes, the backdrop of the COP26. So climate change is really a major factor here. Now, EIE, what happened is that working with colleagues in emergency in education, you will find that funding education is not a priority for most of them. They tend to fund the life-saving kind of issues, and they forget education. But actually, for many of our communities, education is the forefront of what they need. So, for example, some of these communities that have been displaced, you'll find that immediately as they settled, they would begin to think about education. So some of you that have been to some of the towns in South Sudan where you have POCs, you find schools established in the POCs. I was in Malakal, the capital of one of our states, a few weeks ago, and in the POC, you had about 8 schools in the POC. So I think what we need is evidence generated kind of programs where it should inform policy and practice. And that will require funding from partners, funding of these kind of programs so that they can generate adequate data. We have seen with some of the flagships that we have, for example, the GPE, the multilateral funding programs, the GPE, the MYRP, Education Cannot Wait. They tend to work well because you have a forum for all the stakeholders that make decisions. So you have the funders, the humanitarian groups, you have the ministry. So there is an element of ownership in this, and therefore they tend to also support evidence collection. So I think data is important, and we need to collect data. We also need to make sure that this data is disseminated and disseminated well. So we need to have a single source. My colleague calls it a bank, for all of us to look in and use it. If we don't do that, then I think we'll have a problem of attaining the SDG 4, because these children in crisis in places like South Sudan would be left out. So we need to have data, and this data, the situation is fluid, like in South Sudan and many other places. It is fluid, and therefore we have to be responsive to this kind of situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. I think what I hear from your statements is a great emphasis on the fact that affected populations prioritize education, and that in order for us to reach SDG 4, we really need to put efforts into funding, data collection, coordination, and dissemination. Dr. Kuyok, you mentioned global funds such as Education Cannot Wait. And I'm very happy to be joined today by Dr. Christian Stoff, who is the chief of monitoring, evaluation, and global reporting at Education Cannot Wait. In his role, he's responsible for results monitoring, global reporting, evaluations, as well as partnerships and capacity development initiatives to strengthen EIE data systems, which is a key thing that you mentioned, Doctor. So, Christian, I'd love to hear from you. Given your role within ECW, what can you tell us about how you are both capturing and responding to EIE evidence needs? And what do you believe is required to bridge the gaps between evidence needs and current funding? Christian?
Thank you, Nadeen, and hello everybody virtually from Geneva. I would say in terms of data, you can outline actually two essential data types that are needed to inform evidence and to inform policies and programming. One being data on needs, to understand what is the situation on the ground, how can you best then design your programs. For that, you need information and data on what works and what doesn't. Now, there have been a lot of strides made on that front from the development side in development settings in education. However, in humanitarian space, there are serious gaps around that kind of evidence. We have made great progress around data on needs, the global education cluster, with support also from ECW as well as other partners such as ECHO, the EU. A lot of investments have been made, tools have been created, mechanisms set up. So there's more and more secondary data review support happening globally to the countries. There's more and more joint education needs assessments that really inform humanitarian programming. However, when we look at on data and evidence of what works and what doesn't, there are serious gaps. And at the very basic level, to understand what works and what doesn't, we need better monitoring of outcome level results. Without understanding of whether a program or an initiative has achieved progress towards increasing access, retention of students, whether children are participating or whether children are learning. Without data on outcomes, we cannot even think and measure of what actually was effective in those interventions. So overlaying research initiatives on those ecosystems where we lack this outcome level data is really difficult and challenging. ECW therefore really prioritizes outcome level monitoring. We are still a fairly young fund over the last 3 years in place, but one big initiative that my M&E and global reporting team is focusing on is really finding ways to embed measurements of learning outcomes into our programs. And when we look at learning outcomes, we are not talking only about academic learning outcomes. However, we'll also look at holistic learning outcomes because the protection side is crucial in crisis settings. We have to look at that children also have improved psychosocial well-being in the face of conflict. Now, I'm happy to say that over the years, more and more data is generated from our programs. And we start to see baseline data, at least for learning outcomes. However, if you want to measure change in learning outcomes, you do need at least 2 data points or some statement on data of what has changed in the learning outcomes, which can be just 1 point of data collection if you wish. And similar statements were made, for example, by Jaime Saavedra yesterday, saying that for SDG 4 monitoring, we need at least 2 data points to measure trends, to see whether improvements have been made. So these kinds of steps are really precursors to ensure that we have evaluability of our programs. When we launch a thematic evaluation, for example, to see what has worked and what hasn't, then we do need that outcome level data, plus other data ideally on context evolutions and also the implementation quality of the initiatives. So measuring, for example, when it comes to learning, we would need to also see whether children have participated more. How did the attendance evolve? There's no point in training teachers and then measuring just learning outcomes, while at the same time the issue was around lack of attendance of students in the first place. So we need kind of a data set that allows us to look at all these different aspects to understand what works and what doesn't. Now, in humanitarian setting, when it comes to 6 to 12 months programs, rapid response, we cannot overburden the programs. There are too many challenges in getting this response out, in restoring education access as quickly as possible. So there, we should not overburden the system. However, when it comes to multi-year programs, many crises that we work in are actually, in fact, protracted crises out there. So they last for many, many years already, and the trends continue. In these settings, we cannot go on with one-year programs and having rapid responses to those crisis settings. We need sort of multi-year programs, which ECW also is supporting with the multi-year resilience programs. And for those programs that run 3 years, there we should start to embed and think about outcomes more and more. However, the question is, should within these programs, should they have integrated into their fabric a full-blown research concept with measuring context, program implementation quality and outcomes, or should we focus just on barely outputs and outcomes, but not these other factors, but leave those up to the research community to take up as triggers interesting, maybe positive deviants or case studies where learning outcomes have improved a lot, and you have some data on outputs, but then you can actually get in with special research initiatives to look at what were the factors, what was the context, and then additional data collection can be actually added to that component without overburdening the actual program itself. So these are strategic questions that we are facing at the moment and that we are discussing. How much research should be embedded in our programs? Finally, I would say we do have a paradox. So on the one hand, we have in a way a lack of evidence when it comes to designing programs. However, on the other side, we also see that there's a lot of wastage and lack of use of evidence when designing programs. When you look at the global websites, INEE, ECW, global partners, bilateral donors, there's an abundance of tools. And when we give guidance to our grantees, there's often the feeling that there's lack of capacity to absorb the multitude of tools and read the research, while at the same time being on the ground and having to manage the coordination and respond to those challenges. So what we need is better summaries of the evidence, better synthesis of the evidence that exists, even though there are only few so far. What we also need is clearly formulated tools, maybe harmonized tools across partners, to actually make sure that different funders don't require different tools and mechanisms when to their grantees when designing programs, so that basically the messages are clear when we go out there. Finally, also data sharing is important. At the moment, we still have a lot of fragmented efforts from different grantees and partners on the ground, because in a way, you can say it's a competitive advantage of an agency to generate and have the data and say, we have this system, data system, and this is a selling point for them for getting funds from funders. But we need to move to joint approaches where data sharing is embedded, and we funders can play a crucial role in these efforts. So ECW continues to support key partners such as Global Education Cluster, on the needs assessment sides, on the outcome monitoring side. We work with INEE to ensure data sharing globally. We work with UNESCO on data sharing platforms in countries. We work also with NYU TIES And we work with Cambridge Education on holistic learning outcome measurement, establishing those systems and looking how these outcome monitoring systems can be set up in these difficult circumstances. And finally, we do start to strengthen our knowledge sharing initiatives, looking at lessons learned from grantees and enabling learning across programs, across countries on common challenges that we face. And finally, the more outcome monitoring data we have on trends around outcome monitoring, we then actually execute thematic evaluations to look really at what works and what doesn't with additional funding. Thanks. That's it from our side.
Thank you so much, Dr. Christian. I think you highlighted a lot of important points. First, starting with the need to focus on learning outcomes. And here you also mentioned holistic learning outcomes, which I would love to hear more from the panel on that. And another thing you mentioned is that there is a real need for us to come together in partnership and coordinate with one another in order to achieve a lot of to meet a lot of the evidence needs that are in place. But one key element that you highlighted was also that there does seem to be a gap between the kind of information and resources that are available to us and the ways that they are taken into action and practice. And on that note, actually, I would love to hear from Catherine Gladwell, who is joining us here today. Catherine is the founder and chief executive officer at Refugee Education UK, which is an NGO that is working to support education for refugee and asylum-seeking young through a combination of research, training, and direct programmatic interventions. She is also a founding director of Jigsaw Consult, where she specializes in research around education and forced migration. And Catherine, from your perspective, as a practitioner and a researcher, I would love if you can tell us more about how funding for education in emergencies could help us bridge these gaps between knowledge and practice. And what do you see are key actions that we as funders need to do to support this process?
Great. Thank you for having me, Nadeen. Thank you for your words as well, Dr. Kuyok and Christian. So as Nadeen said, I'm not here representing a donor. I'm a kind of blend between evidence builder at Jigsaw and practitioner at Refugee Education UK. So I kind of have these two worlds that feel like they're constantly intersecting between evidence and practice, and I think it makes me mindful, sometimes on a daily basis, of the need for that kind of constant feedback loop between those two things. So today, firstly, I'm going to put my evidence builder hat on and just share a couple of lessons related to financing from a Dubai Cares funded program that we've been working on together. And then after that, I'm going to put my practitioner hat on and share a couple of things that I think funders can do to help us as practitioners both benefit from and contribute to evidence building. So, evidence building hat first. The project that Dubai Cares has funded is a longitudinal research study called Voices of Refugee Youth, and it's designed to build evidence around post-primary education for young refugees. And obviously, I'm not going to talk about the emerging findings from that study today, but if you're interested, you can ask me later. I'm just going to pick out two particular things that are relevant, I think, to financing. So firstly, this study has really underlined the importance of financing initiatives that build evidence in a way that co-creates with affected populations. So in this project, as an example, we've employed 31 refugee youth researchers, mostly graduates from universities in their host countries in Pakistan and in Rwanda, to work on the project. So we co-created the methodology together, they are leading the data collection amongst their peers, and then together we're co-creating all of the outputs. So financing initiatives that co-create evidence with affected populations. Secondly, I think, and this is possibly one of the things that I most love, I think it demonstrates the potential for funding evidence-building initiatives that right from the outset integrate a concrete contribution to the issue at hand. So here, the refugee youth researchers are studying an online blended learning module, university accredited in research methods, that we've written especially for the forced migration context. So provision of higher level accredited education for refugees, which is one of the very issues that the evidence is looking into, is integrated and blended into the project right from the outset. So, co-creating evidence with affected populations, funding initiatives that blend evidence building with making a direct contribution to the issue. What does this mean for the donor community? Well, firstly, this won't come as a surprise, I don't think, but this type of evidence building is resource intensive. And if we're going to see more of it, then it does require the same type of commitment that we have seen modeled by some of the donors here today from a wider group. Secondly, it requires flexibility. There are layers of complexity and logistics woven into this type of work, and that was even before COVID got added into the equation. Finally, and this is coming back to my first point about the need for the constant feedback loop between evidence building and practice, putting my practitioner hat back on, I'm generally astounded at how rarely donors ask whether the proposed programmatic intervention actually is based on evidence. And of course that needs to be done in a way that is accessible and appropriate and proportionate to the amount of time and money that is being invested for practitioners in busy crisis contexts. But it is possible to do that, and there are ways that we can improve on that. And I think the question does need to be asked. Linked to this, and again as a practitioner, in our work at Refugee Education UK, we have data coming out of our ears, both outputs data and outcomes data. But the majority of this, we collect because we choose to collect it, not because we're required to collect it. And we don't have the resources to turn that data into products that others might find useful. And I know so many other practitioner organizations that are in that same position. What I would really love to see, and of course everyone does their best with bits of unrestricted funding from here and there, and occasionally a grant that comes along with the type of integrated approach that Christian was talking about. But I would really love to see it as standard that when programmatic implementations are funded, that an evidence building component is integrated from the start, and that that's no longer unusual, but that it's the norm. So, in conclusion, my evidence-building hat over the last few years has shown that we can, and I think should and need to, finance evidence-building that's co-created with affected populations. And the main reason for this is that it actually creates better quality evidence, and that we can and should finance evidence building that makes a tangible contribution to the issue at hand. And my practitioner hat has shown that I expect and actually want as a practitioner to be asked if what I'm proposing to do, particularly if it is a multi-year project, is backed up by the evidence. And I want to have opportunities to take the data that we have and to use it and to share it and to package it in a way that is accessible and useful for other people. So, thank you.
Well, that's on me. I didn't have the mic on. Thank you, Catherine, for your comments. And I think that what you highlighted about the importance of including affected populations, working with them in evidence building, but also ways that we as funders can make sure that whether we are funding evidence creation efforts solely or in our general funding to programs, that we have integrated that evidence building and evidence sharing approach. That is very key. And it makes me want to turn to our colleague Gerhard here, whose work has touched upon on some of the points that you mentioned, Catherine. So Gerhard, I would love to hear from you. You have taken on a role where you have been supporting the education and displacement portfolio at Porticus and have worked to support evidence efforts at many different levels. And so can you tell us a bit more about how Porticus's support to evidence in education and emergencies has facilitated not only creating new knowledge, but also focusing on the uptake and use of evidence, whether through specific programs or more generally? And if you can share a bit from your experience, what you see are some key learnings for funders who are hoping to implement a similar approach.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nadeen. And I think we need to remember that we work in a sector where the needs are overwhelming and the resources are limited. So we need to make sure that our investments are effective. And how can we make sure that investments are effective? We only know if we have data and if we have evidence. So for this reason, evidence generation needs to be integrated into our DNA. And for Porticus, the knowledge and evidence in education and emergencies is indeed very critical. So we support knowledge and evidence at several levels. So for one, we have generation of knowledge and evidence at the programmatic level through external evaluations and research with partners. Then we also invest in foundational research. So basic, what are theories of change for psychosocial support and social and emotional learning in crisis contexts, for example. Then it's also about generation of evidence through investments into measurement and assessment tools for learning outcomes and for holistic learning outcomes. And it's also about the generation of evidence through established mechanisms, such as the Humanitarian Education Accelerator, where we work with ECW and UNHCR. But I think what Dr. Kuyok and Catherine have mentioned is really critical. Evidence needs to be relevant. It requires ownership. And whose ownership? The ownership can only be established if policymakers, researchers and practitioners are jointly involved. So it's not about only one side, like the researcher defining the research agenda, but it needs the involvement of the policymakers and of the practitioners from the outset. And so I think this is very important to keep in mind. And here the process becomes equally important as the results, because only in the process of co-creation you can establish trust, you can establish needs, you can establish what kind of evidence is relevant for which side. Because we have seen, for example, that the evidence that's required for practitioners and for policymakers, for example, is very different. So with one partnership, with 3A Consortium, NYU and IRC, they established an umbrella for research practitioner consortiums that included governmental stakeholders and non-governmental stakeholders. And we had very different discussions with governmental stakeholders and with non-governmental stakeholders. So that distinction is very important to keep in mind. Basically, we need to remember and we need to find out who requires what kind of evidence and take that into account in the process. So again, co-creation, co-creation, co-creation. I think these are really keywords between researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. We cannot ourselves allow anymore that we create evidence in isolation from its uptake. And we try to promote a culture of uptake and learning. For Porticus, we ask our partners when they submit proposals, as Catherine just mentioned, what is the evidence base behind the approach? We ask for the evidence, and that's also a selection criteria for funding certain initiatives to see if they are evidence-based. And so we deliberately want to promote a culture where we connect the researchers, practitioners, and the policymakers through funding, but also not only through funding, but also through engagement. In, for example, we work with Christian and ECW, but also with Save the Children on the INE data reference group. So it's not about only funding, but it's also about working jointly and bring different players together, either horizontally at the funder level or vertically through research policy and practitioners. We are also engaged with Joseph on B Squared, building evidence in education, where there's a special interest group on education in emergencies. And finally, we work with a rather new organization named Educationorg on the uptake of evidence. And Educationorg has recently released a white paper to advance evidence use in education, which also addresses explicitly the barriers of uptake and the need for sector synthesis of evidence to boost progress. And I can really strongly recommend to also have a look at that white paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerhard. I think you mentioning the Education.org white paper, it is very inspiring. It's something that Dubai Cares has also worked with Education.org on, and I think was a key inspiration actually for a lot of my questions today. So I do encourage everyone to take a look at it. And I think, Gerhard, you mentioned that doing this requires a lot of diverse actors to be present. And I think one of the actors I'd love to hear from right now, who maybe more recently has become a bit more active in this work, Joseph Wales, you know, as the person who is leading on FCDO's Education and Emergencies research agenda. And as you are working with many different partners, including your own country offices, researchers, and partner organizations, I want to hear from you, based on all these observations and engagements that you've been involved in, what do you see as promising approaches for financing action-oriented, demand-driven, and user-led evidence for EIE? And how are these being incorporated into your own work at FCDO?
Thanks very much, Nadeen. It's great to be able to speak, and I'm really glad to be on the panel with such an interesting range of people. It's often a challenge, I think, being the last person, because the most of the wise things have already been said. But that does also put you in a sort of advantageous position to be able to draw on them for that as well. And I think that's partly how we're approaching our thinking on this new research program that we're hoping to get active in the next couple of months, and really kind of have a big major initiative. To build more evidence around education in emergencies and to draw on a lot of what has gone before. I'm conscious of time, so I think there's a few key points that I try and draw out here. And I think so. The first thing I think in terms of kind of what I've seen, which has worked well, is the need that really at the very beginning of a research program to have a very clear idea of what exactly it is you're trying to do with it. Who is it that you're looking to influence? Whose behaviors are you trying to shape with the work that you're doing? And a key thing here is really making sure that researchers are connected up to the key stakeholders, that they have an understanding of who is in a position to work on an issue in question, but also kind of what the incentives of those different actors are and what their capacity is as well, to make sure that you are co-creating this, that you're asking questions that are relevant to the policymakers and the decision makers in the context, but also that you really understand their perspective on the issue and the capacities and challenges that they're going to have in terms of working on any recommendations that you produce. That having kind of those people in the room at the very beginning, when you're designing the research program, when you're putting together the questions and the methodology, is really crucial to making sure you're producing evidence that's relevant to them and that is actually useful in practice. And really beginning to establish those connections early on as well between researchers, drawing on what communities exist already, but also helping to kind of build fresh connections as well. And from a funder perspective, I think the key thing here, particularly for a bilateral donor as well, like FCDO, is making sure that you're linking with other organizations who are already in the field, that you're drawing those research teams together with people who are kind of already there, that you're using your convening power, but also, and I think this is kind of a consistent theme as well, that you are understanding that that's kind of a whole body of work in itself, that you need to try and build that in as much as possible for your research teams and those who are going to be working on these issues. So I think that's the first thing, having a clear idea of kind of who the stakeholders are, what their incentives are, and being able to kind of have that time at the beginning to work with them to shape the questions and the direction of the work. I think the second thing then, which is crucial, is having an idea of basically how the evidence that we're producing is going to arrive in the room where decisions are made, and having a very clear idea of the pathways that are going to be gone through there. we talked earlier already about kind of the ideas around the sort of idea of a knowledge bank for education and emergencies research, the importance as well of kind of networks and connections like INEE. I think really that's kind of the key element there. That either you need to be in a position where you're working with researchers and researchers who are well connected to decision makers in the context, or they need to be connected into those people who ministers and decision makers trust and will go to for information. That either your work needs to be kind of known by the people who ministers and other actors will go to for information, or it needs to be so widespread in terms of the findings of it that it's kind of second nature to almost anybody in the field who you might go to for that information. So thinking about kind of who decision makers trust for their information, what kind of information is going to be credible and useful for them, but then also thinking about how do you network and link up both the researchers and these broader evidence communities to try and get that information, not just even to the page in terms of sort of useful synthesis reports, but off that page and into kind of the hands of the people who will then make decisions in practice. I think, again, from funders, a lot of this is about thinking about, partly who you're able to connect up your research programs with, how can you make sure that you're bridging some of these gaps between practitioners and researchers initially, but also are you giving the teams that are working on this the time and the space and the resources that they need to kind of embed themselves in a context to understand those connections and to be able to kind of link up those different types of factors. I think the final points really, I suppose, then are just around the importance of giving flexibility to researchers, both in terms of kind of the fact that these are rapidly changing contexts, things will change quite frequently, there may be new opportunities to emerge, and it's not necessarily the same thing as kind of untied funding exactly, or as but it's about making sure that you have kind of built in the time and the space to allow researchers to kind of explore it, maybe not thought were important initiatives, but then when they're engaging with actors on the ground, realize that actually these are vital parts of the puzzle which we need to pursue, and having that flexibility there. I think then the final point is partly about both sort of how we're linking across different types of evidence and how we're prioritizing that. I think we've heard quite a bit already about the importance, particularly in the education and emergency sphere, of even just beginning to improve very basic data collection, making sure that we are doing monitoring and evaluation, that we're looking at outcomes and outcomes, and that we're able to kind of track over time the impact that our programs are having. And all of that is definitely crucial in terms of making the case for why education and emergency should be prioritized, as well as thinking about sort of the design of programs as well. I think alongside that, though, we do need to have kind of more of a heterodox approach to the ways we understand evidence. The crucial thing is not only kind of what is working and where, but why is it working in that way. If we have an initiative which has been very successful in South Sudan, what is it that has made it work there? What are the pathways used? And can that be applied in northern Nigeria? Is it relevant there? Are there elements that can be drawn out from it? And so making sure that you are looking at the incentives that are in place, looking at the structures which are in place, doing kind of a whole range of qualitative work alongside the work kind of on that input-output piece is really important. And I think one thing which has been learnt probably more broadly from work on kind of education systems and how to improve learning outcomes sort of outside of the education and emergency sphere is precisely the importance of that kind of the delivery element of the work, and understanding kind of the pathways that it can use, the incentives of the different actors there, so that we don't have a situation where we're very clear that we've had an impact, but we don't necessarily understand how we can use that information elsewhere, as important as that initial result is. So yeah, I think those are kind of the four things that I would highlight there.
Thank you so much, Joseph. I see we are actually running out of time here. So just to end it all for this panel, I want to hear from everyone. If in one sentence you can tell me, how can we work together to reach some of the goals that we mentioned in our session today? Dr. Kuyok, if I can hear from you.
Thank you very much. I think as Christian was saying, what we need is that we need to have data that captures the needs of the children. We also need data on the best approaches that worked. And to do that, we need to have common platforms. For example, in South Sudan, at the moment, we have introduced distance education program as a result of the COVID-19, but we don't know how best it is working. So So it is important that we integrate research and data collection on this kind of thing. And then the most important thing is we really need to collaborate together because the situation is really very fluid.
Thank you. Catherine, one word.
I think what we've done with the Voices of Refugee Youth project and the youth researchers that we worked with over the last few years has really been like proof of concept for us. And so I think what we can do, and I guess our commitment, is that we don't want to stop with just 2 countries. We want to do more of this. We think it can work on a larger scale. And so we're looking forward to working together with a whole variety of different people and making that happen. And
Thank you.
shifting
And
the
I'll
sector.
ask the virtual speakers quick intervention from you before we wrap up. So Christian, if you can get us started.
Yeah, from my side, research and knowledge is essentially a public good. So we need to make sure that we invest into it through a joint fashion so that we don't have fragmentation in the system to generate the data, and we have data sharing across partners. So we can't work on with these fragmented approaches that are currently doing, and funders should get together to have harmonized messages to their grantees in doing so.
Gerhard?
Yeah, I think for me the central issue is really to bring researchers, practitioners and policymakers, but also the people affected, to bring them together to create a culture of learning and evidence.
And Joseph?
Yeah, similar to Els, I think that the key things first, think about the use of the evidence, what are you putting it together for? And secondly, how can we network, connect with each other, and make sure that we're sharing it as widely and as practically as possible.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. I wish we had more time, but thank you for joining us. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of this very important day at the Rewired Summit. Take care.